The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Special Agent Richardson stepped out of his government-issued black SUV. The air was thick with humidity, typical for this small southern town where magnolia trees lined the streets and gossip traveled faster than the summer breeze. After 15 years with the FBI, he'd investigated cases in countless cities, but something about this place made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He adjusted his perfectly pressed suit and grabbed his leather briefcase, feeling the weight of both his badge and responsibility. The Civil Rights Division had sent him here for a reason. Reports of systematic harassment that had gone unchecked for far too long. As one of the Bureau's top investigators, Richardson had earned his reputation through intelligence, patience, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The police station sat in a brick building that had probably been impressive in the 1950s, but now looked tired and worn, much like the attitudes he was about to confront. As he pushed through the heavy glass doors, the blast of air conditioning hit him along with the familiar smell of coffee and paper files. The front desk officer barely looked up from his computer screen. "Can I help you?" he drawled, his tone suggesting he'd rather do anything but. "Special Agent Richardson, FBI." He held up his credentials, the gold badge catching the fluorescent light. "I'm here to see Lieutenant Barrett." The officer's fingers stopped typing. His eyes flicked from the badge to Richardson's face, then back again, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together in his mind. "Wait here," the officer said, disappearing down a hallway lined with faded photos of past police chiefs. All wearing the same stern expression, all sharing the same pale complexion. 5 minutes stretched into 15. Richardson stood patiently, observing the steady stream of officers and staff moving through the building. He noticed how conversations hushed when they spotted him, the way curious glances turned to whispers behind hands and coffee cups. Finally, heavy footsteps announced the arrival of Lieutenant Barrett. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a crew cut that seemed carved from steel and a jaw set so tight it could crack walnuts. His uniform was pristine, but his eyes were cold as winter frost. "FBI, Hull." Barrett's voice carried across the lobby like a challenge. He made no move to extend his hand. Didn't know they were sending someone today. Richardson kept his expression neutral, professional. "I believe the Civil Rights Division sent notification last week about my arrival." "Must have gotten lost in the mail," Barrett said, though the slight twitch in his cheek suggested otherwise. "What brings the federal government to our quiet little town?" "I have some questions about recent incidents in the commercial district," Richardson replied, meeting Barrett's gaze steadily. "Perhaps we could discuss this in your office." Barrett's eyes narrowed, scanning Richardson's credentials again as if hoping to find a flaw, a reason to deny him entry. Finding none, he gestured stiffly toward the hallway. "Follow me." As they walked, Richardson noticed the subtle changes in the atmosphere. Doors closed quietly. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the air seemed to grow thicker with tension. Barrett's office was a monument to his 20 years on the force. Plaques and certificates covered one wall, while a gun rack dominated another. He took his time settling behind his desk, leaving Richardson standing until he finally waved him toward a chair that had seen better days. "So," Barrett leaned back, his chair creaking under the weight of his authority. "What exactly does Washington think is happening in our town?" Richardson opened his briefcase, pulled out a thin file. "I'm here to investigate several reported civil rights violations. Multiple complaints have been filed." "Complaints?" Barrett's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "People complain about everything these days. Doesn't make it true." "That's why I'm here. To find the truth," Richardson replied, his calm voice a contrast to Barrett's barely contained hostility. "I'll need access to your records, incident reports from the past 6 months. Those take time to process. Paperwork. Procedures." Barrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Could be days. Weeks even." "I've got time," Richardson said, settling back in his chair, and a federal mandate that supersedes local procedures. The ceiling fan spun lazily above them, its shadows dancing across Barrett's reddening face. The lieutenant was used to being the most powerful man in the room, but today that power had met its match in quiet determination and federal authority. The game had begun, and both men knew it, but only one of them knew all the rules. The following morning, Richardson drove slowly through the commercial district, his trained eye taking in every detail. Local shops lined both sides of Main Street, a mix of family businesses that had weathered decades of economic ups and downs. Some storefronts sparkled with fresh paint and neat displays, while others showed signs of struggle, their windows cluttered with faded sale signs. He pulled into a parking spot in front of a small bakery, the smell of fresh bread drifting through his open car window. As he checked his notes, he caught a glimpse of Barrett's patrol car in his rearview mirror, cruising past like a shark circling its prey. Richardson smiled slightly. He expected this. Inside the bakery, the owner looked up nervously as the bell above the door chimed. Her eyes darted to the window, where Barrett's car was now parked across the street. "Good morning," Richardson said warmly, showing his badge. "I'm with the FBI. Would you mind if we talked for a few minutes?" The owner wrung her hands in her flour-dusted apron. "I don't want any trouble," she whispered, glancing again at the patrol car outside. "You're not in any trouble," Richardson assured her. "I'm here to listen." Slowly, her story spilled out like water from a cracked dam. The random health inspections that happened 3 times more often than at other bakeries. The parking tickets that appeared whenever her regular customers stopped by. The mysterious phone calls that scared away her suppliers. Richardson took careful notes, keeping his expression neutral even as his stomach tightened with each new detail. Through the window, he could see Barrett still sitting in his patrol car, pretending to write in his notebook. As Richardson left the bakery, Barrett's car pulled away from the curb, only to reappear 2 blocks later when Richardson stopped at a family-owned electronics store. The same scene played out at a small clothing boutique, then a restaurant. Each time Richardson parked, Barrett's patrol car would materialize nearby, its presence an unspoken threat to anyone who might speak with the FBI agent. By early afternoon, Richardson decided to get lunch at a small diner. He barely opened his menu when Barrett walked in, making a show of adjusting his gun belt as he approached. "License and registration," Barrett said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Richardson looked up calmly. "Excuse me. Your vehicle is parked in a loading zone. Need to see your license and registration." "There's no loading zone sign there, Lieutenant," Richardson replied, gesturing to his perfectly legal parking spot visible through the diner's window. "Signs must have been stolen again," Barrett said with a cold smile. "Happens all the time in this part of town." Richardson reached for his credentials, the same ones he'd shown Barrett yesterday, the same ones he'd shown him 3 times already today. Will these do? The diner had gone quiet. Every eye was on them, every ear straining to hear. Barrett made a show of examining the FBI credentials, holding them up to the light as if checking for counterfeits. "You know," Barrett said, his voice dripping with false concern, "we've had problems with people impersonating law enforcement around here. Can't be too careful." "How interesting," Richardson replied, pulling out his phone. "I'd love to see those reports. In fact, why don't I call the FBI field office right now? We can verify my credentials and discuss those impersonation cases at the same time." Barrett's smile flickered. He handed back the credentials and walked out without another word. But Richardson knew this wasn't over. The lieutenant was marking his territory, sending a message to anyone who might think of talking to the FBI agent. As Richardson finished his lunch, he noticed the diner's owner watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. The man approached cautiously, speaking in a low voice. "That happens a lot around here," he said, glancing at the door. "Not just to you. To anyone who, well, anyone they don't think belongs." I'd like to hear more about that, Richardson said quietly, pulling out his card. When you feel safe to talk. The owner pocketed the card quickly, like it might burn him if he held it too long. Outside, Barrett's patrol car rolled past again, a reminder that in this town, even the smallest actions were being watched. But Barrett had made a crucial mistake. His obvious intimidation tactics weren't just harassment. They were creating a pattern, building a case with each pass of his patrol car. Richardson had learned long ago that sometimes the best strategy was to let your opponent think they were winning, all while they dug their own hole deeper and deeper. The real question was, how many others would find the courage to speak up before this was over? The pile of manila folders on Richardson's hotel room desk grew taller with each passing day. He turned the small room into a makeshift office, with photos and documents carefully arranged on the walls, connected by red strings that traced patterns of harassment and discrimination. The air conditioner hummed steadily as he reviewed his notes from the day's interviews. A soft knock at his door made him pause. Through the peephole, he saw the nervous face of the diner owner he met earlier that week. Looking both ways down the hallway, the man quickly slipped inside when Richardson opened the door. "I brought these," the owner said, pulling a stack of wrinkled papers from his jacket. "Been keeping them for 3 years. Every time they came by, every inspection, every fine. Dates, times, names, everything." Richardson carefully spread the papers across his bed. Years of systematic harassment documented in faded ink and coffee-stained margins. The owner had recorded it all. Sudden tax audits, mysterious anonymous complaints, frequent police visits that emptied his restaurant during the busiest hours. "Your notes are very detailed," Richardson said, impressed by the meticulous records. The owner's hands trembled slightly. "My grandfather taught me, when things aren't right, keep a record. He lived through times when that was the only defense we had." As Richardson copied the documents, the owner spoke about others who had similar stories. A dry cleaner who'd been denied permits for code violations that mysteriously didn't apply to other businesses. A grocery store owner whose delivery trucks were stopped and searched so often as suppliers started charging extra for the route. "People are scared," the owner said quietly. "But they're also tired of being scared." The next morning, Richardson visited the county clerk's office. The clerk, an older woman with kind eyes and a steel-gray bun, watched him review business permit applications. "Such a shame about all those lost files," she said loudly enough for her coworkers to hear. Then, in a whisper, "Check the basement archives. Box 47B. Some files get lost upstairs but seem to find their way down there." In the dimly lit basement, Richardson discovered a goldmine. Dozens of rejected permit applications, all from minority business owners, all with nearly identical rejection reasons. But more telling were the approved applications filed on the same days. Different businesses, different owners, same circumstances, different outcomes. He was photographing the documents when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Barrett's voice echoed off the concrete walls. "Awful dark down here," the lieutenant called out. "Wouldn't want any accidents with all these old papers. Fire hazard, you know." Richardson continued his work, speaking without looking up. "Good point, Lieutenant. That's why I already sent copies to the FBI field office. Standard procedure. Backing up evidence." The footsteps stopped. After a long moment, they retreated up the stairs. That afternoon, Richardson sat in his car outside the local coffee shop, reviewing his notes. A tap on his window made him look up. An elderly man stood there, leaning on a cane. "Been watching you," the old man said after Richardson rolled down his window. "You're stirring up quite a storm." "Just doing my job, sir." The old man nodded slowly. "Was a time when folks like Barrett ran everything around here. Thought those days were behind us. But the poison just went underground, like a snake hiding in the grass." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. I worked at City Hall for 40 years. Janitor sees things, hears things. Nobody pays much attention to an old man pushing a broom. Might find some of these names interesting. Richardson accepted the notebook, understanding its value. Each page contained dates, conversations, and connections that linked Barrett to a network of officials who'd worked together to maintain their grip on power. As the sun set, Richardson added the new information to his wall of evidence. The pattern was clear now, not just isolated incidents, but a coordinated system of harassment and discrimination. Barrett wasn't just a prejudiced officer. He was part of something larger, something that had wrapped its roots around the town like choking vines. His phone buzzed with a text from the field office. They'd received his latest report and were sending additional agents to help process the growing evidence. Richardson smiled, knowing that with each new piece of documentation, each brave person who came forward, Barrett's world was getting smaller. The truth was coming to light, one story at a time. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as Richardson set up his recording equipment. He'd chosen this location carefully for his witness interviews, neutral ground, away from the watchful eyes of the police station. The young store owner sitting across from him adjusted her collar, her fingers trembling slightly as she recounted years of harassment. They would park their patrol cars outside my shop for hours, she explained, her voice growing stronger with each word. Customers would turn away as soon as they saw the police. How can a business survive when people are afraid to walk through the door? Richardson nodded encouragingly, his recorder capturing every word. That's when he heard the heavy footsteps in the hallway. He'd been expecting this. Barrett never could resist making his presence known. The door burst open with a bang that made the store owner jump. Barrett filled the doorframe, his face flushed with anger. Two of his officers flanked him, hands resting on their belts. Well, Barrett drawled, his boots squeaking on the linoleum floor as he stepped inside. Quite the little meeting you've got here. Richardson remained seated, his voice calm and professional. Lieutenant, this is a federal investigation. You're interrupting an official witness interview. Official? Barrett's laugh was sharp and cold. Looks more like you're stirring up trouble in my town. Making people say things that aren't true. The store owner started to stand, but Richardson gestured for her to remain seated. Carefully, smoothly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pressed a button on his body camera. Years of experience had taught him to be prepared for moments like this. Your town? Richardson asked quietly, watching Barrett's face redden further. That's right, my town. Been keeping order here longer than you've been wearing that fancy FBI badge. Barrett leaned over the table, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. And when you leave, which you will, these people still have to live here. Under my watch. The store owner's chin lifted slightly. Are you threatening us, Lieutenant? Barrett spun toward her. Threatening? I'm protecting this community. From outsiders who don't understand how things work here. From people who don't know their place. Their place? Richardson repeated, letting Barrett's words hang in the air. The camera captured every moment, every twist of Barrett's features as he realized what he'd said. You know exactly what I mean, Barrett snarled, jabbing a finger at Richardson. Coming here, turning good people against their own police force. Making up lies about discrimination. Richardson stood slowly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Barrett's rage. Everything that's happening right now is being recorded, Lieutenant. Every word, every gesture. Would you like to rethink your position? You think a recording scares me. Barrett's hand twitched near his belt. Recordings can be lost. Equipment can malfunction. Reports can be misplaced. The store owner's voice cut through the tension. Not this time. I'm live streaming this whole thing to my phone's cloud storage. Barrett's head snapped toward her. She held up her phone, its red recording light blinking steadily. My teenage daughter showed me how. Amazing what technology can do these days, isn't it? The color drained from Barrett's face as he realized he'd walked right into their trap. His own words, his threats, his true nature, all captured from multiple angles. No way to deny it, no way to make it disappear. This interview is over, he growled, backing toward the door. And you'll be hearing from our department's lawyer. Actually, Richardson said, standing to his full height, you'll be hearing from the Justice Department. Soon. After Barrett and his officers stormed out, the store owner let out a shaky breath. I can't believe I just did that. Richardson smiled warmly. You did more than that. You just helped break down a wall of fear that's been standing in this town for far too long. Outside, they could hear Barrett's patrol car screeching away. But this time, the sound wasn't intimidating. Instead, it was the sound of a man running from the truth he could no longer hide. The recording devices blinked steadily, holding irrefutable evidence of what happened when power met its match in courage and preparation. The game had changed, and Barrett had just lost his most important piece. Back in his hotel room, Richardson spread everything out on his bed. Interview transcripts, permit records, surveillance footage, and now the recordings from the community center confrontation. Each piece was a pixel in a larger picture of corruption, and that picture was becoming crystal clear. His phone buzzed. A text from the diner owner. Check your email. Found something you need to see. The email contained scanned copies of old city council minutes. Richardson's eyes widened as he read. 10 years ago, Barrett had been a rookie officer, but his uncle had been the head of the permit board. Together, they had redrawn the city's business zones, pushing certain businesses to the outskirts while favoring others in prime locations. A knock at his door made him pause. Through the peephole, he saw the clerk from the records office, clutching her purse tightly. I shouldn't be here, she whispered as he let her in. But I couldn't sleep knowing what I know. She pulled out a thick folder. These are copies of every business permit application from the last 5 years. I've been keeping track, marking patterns. Look at the dates, the signatures. Richardson flipped through the pages. The pattern was obvious once you knew what to look for. Applications from certain business owners were always reviewed by the same committee members, always delayed for the same vague reasons. Barrett's sister-in-law works in the permit office, the clerk explained. His cousin handles zoning appeals. They've built quite a network. As she spoke, Richardson's phone lit up with messages from other community members. Like a dam breaking, people were finally finding the courage to come forward. A retired postal worker who'd witnessed selective enforcement of parking laws. A former city maintenance worker who'd been ordered to delay repairs in certain neighborhoods. Working through the night, Richardson created a detailed timeline. Barrett wasn't just a prejudiced officer. He was the visible face of a system that had been quietly discriminating for years. The lieutenant's recent behavior was just the latest chapter in a long story of abuse of power. The next morning, Richardson visited the local library. The elderly librarian, her eyes sharp behind thick glasses, led him to the newspaper archives. Been waiting for someone to look into this, she said, pulling out bound volumes of old newspapers. Noticed anything about these business closure announcements? Richardson studied the yellowed pages. Over the years, dozens of minority-owned businesses had shut down, all citing similar reasons: repeated inspections, mounting fines, mysterious complaints. They thought nobody was keeping track, the librarian said with a small smile. But some of us remember. Some of us write things down. Back at his temporary office, Richardson received a call from a young officer who'd recently joined the force. I transferred here 6 months ago, the officer explained quietly. They have a system for patrol routes. Certain neighborhoods get checked every hour, others barely see a police car all day. It's all coded in the scheduling software. I can show you. Richardson's heart raced as the officer walked him through the patrol data. The discrimination wasn't just individual actions. It was programmed into the department's daily operations. That evening, as the sun set over the small town, Richardson sat at his desk, surrounded by evidence of years of systematic discrimination. His phone buzzed again. Another community member finding the courage to speak up. He thought about Barrett's face during the confrontation, the moment when the lieutenant realized he'd lost control. But this was bigger than one prejudiced officer. This was about dismantling a system that had been hurting people for years. The next step would require careful planning. The evidence had to be presented in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Barrett and his allies would fight back. They had too much to lose not to. But as Richardson looked at the wall of evidence, at the brave people who'd risked everything to come forward, he knew the truth couldn't be buried anymore. The town was finally ready for change, and he was going to make sure justice was served. His phone buzzed one final time that night. A message from FBI headquarters. They'd reviewed his preliminary findings and were sending a full task force. The real work was about to begin. The city council chamber was packed. Every wooden bench creaked with the weight of concerned citizens, and people lined the walls 3 deep. The air conditioning struggled against the heat of so many bodies, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. At the front of the room, the police chief sat with Barrett and other senior officers. They'd arrived early, claiming the front row seats like they owned them. Barrett's usual smirk had been replaced by something tighter, more worried. He kept checking his phone, perhaps hoping for some last-minute miracle. Richardson stood at the podium, his evidence organized in neat folders before him. He'd chosen his words carefully, practiced this presentation until every fact, every accusation was bulletproof. Members of the city council, he began, his voice steady and clear. I'm here today to present evidence of systematic civil rights violations within this community. He gestured to the screen behind him, where the first slide appeared, a map of the town with color-coded zones. These are your business districts, he explained. Notice the pattern of permit approvals and denials over the past 5 years. The map changed, showing red dots for denials, green for approvals. The pattern was impossible to ignore. A council member leaned forward. Those could be coincidences. I thought you might say that, Richardson replied, clicking to the next slide. These are the actual permit applications, side by side. Same business type, same financial qualifications, submitted the same week. The only difference. He paused, letting the evidence speak for itself. The owner's backgrounds. Barrett shifted in his seat, his collar suddenly too tight. The police chief's face had gone pale. But this goes beyond permits, Richardson continued. He played the audio from various traffic stops, showed the patrol route data, displayed the statistics of selective enforcement. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer blow. Then came the video from the community center. Barrett's own words echoed through the chamber. These people still have to live here. Under my watch. The lieutenant seemed to shrink in his seat as his threats played out for everyone to hear. An elderly woman in the audience stood up. That's exactly what he said to my grandson when he tried to open his repair shop. Others began nodding, murmuring in agreement. The council chamber erupted with voices as more people stood, each with a story to tell. Years of silent suffering found voice in that moment. The dam had broken. Richardson held up his hand for quiet. But there's more. He clicked to the next slide, showing a complex web of connections. This discrimination wasn't the work of one officer. It was systematic, organized, involving multiple departments. He explained how the permit office coordinated with the police department, how parking enforcement targeted specific businesses, how building inspectors were directed to find violations in certain properties while ignoring others. The evidence is all here, Richardson said, placing a thick binder on each council member's desk. Every incident, every connection, every abuse of power, documented, verified, and witnessed. Barrett finally stood up, his face red. This is a witch hunt. You can't prove. Actually, Richardson interrupted calmly, we can. He nodded to the back of the room, where FBI agents were entering with boxes of additional evidence. The Justice Department has been building this case for months. Your own records prove it. Your own words confirm it. And these brave citizens, he gestured to the crowd, they're not afraid anymore. The police chief's shoulders slumped as he realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about Barrett anymore. This was about a system of discrimination that had operated in the shadows for years, finally exposed to the light. A young business owner in the audience started to clap. Others joined in, the sound building like a wave. Barrett and his allies looked around the room, seeing not the cowed, fearful faces they were used to, but a community united in its demand for justice. Richardson watched as the truth sank in. No amount of intimidation could stop this now. The evidence was too strong, the voices too loud, the justice too long delayed. The revelation wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about giving power back to those who had been silenced for too long. 6 months later, Richardson stood outside the renovated police station, watching as workers installed a new sign. The morning sun caught the fresh paint, making it gleam like a promise kept. The changes weren't just cosmetic. They ran deep into the heart of how the department operated. Inside, new officers were attending their morning briefing. The training room walls displayed updated policies and procedures, with a special focus on community engagement and civil rights. Where Barrett's commendations once hung, there was now a Citizen Oversight Board's mission statement. Quite a difference, said a voice behind him. It was the diner owner, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Richardson. Hard to believe it's the same place. They walked together down Main Street, where the changes were even more visible. New businesses were opening, their fresh awnings adding splashes of color to the streetscape. The fear that had once emptied sidewalks was gone, replaced by the bustle of community coming back to life. Outside the bakery, the owner was setting up her sidewalk display without nervously glancing over her shoulder. Her business had doubled since the changes at the department. No more surprise inspections, she said with a smile as they passed. Unless they're real health inspectors with real badges. The electronics store owner waved from his doorway. He'd expanded his shop into the space next door, hiring local youth for his growing business. My nephew just got accepted to the police academy, he called out proudly. Says he wants to be part of the change. At the community center, a town hall meeting was about to begin. The same room where Barrett had made his fatal mistake was now hosting regular dialogues between police and residents. Richardson slipped into the back, watching as the new police chief, a woman chosen by a reform selection committee, took questions from the audience. The changes aren't just about removing bad officers, she was saying. It's about building a department that truly serves everyone in this community. Richardson noticed the retired librarian in the front row, still taking notes. Some habits die hard, but now her records documented progress instead of prejudice. Next to her sat the young officer who'd exposed the biased patrol routes. He'd recently been promoted to lead a new community outreach unit. After the meeting, Richardson checked his phone. There was a message from the FBI field office. Barrett's trial date had been set. The former lieutenant faced federal charges, along with several other officials who'd been part of his discriminatory network. Many had already taken plea deals, trading information for lighter sentences. Walking back to his car, Richardson passed the clerk from the records office. She was training a new employee on the revised permit system, which now included blind review processes and regular audits. Applications up 60%, she reported happily. From all parts of town. Near the courthouse, he ran into the elderly man who'd first shared his notebook of observations. The old-timer was sitting on a bench, watching kids play in the newly renovated park. Used to be, certain families wouldn't let their children come here, he said thoughtfully. Too many unfriendly eyes watching. Now look at them, all playing together like it should have been all along. As the sun began to set, Richardson took one last drive through the town. The changes weren't perfect. Real progress never is, but they were real and deep. The shadow of fear that had hung over certain neighborhoods was lifting, replaced by something that felt a lot like hope. His phone buzzed with a text from headquarters. His next assignment was ready when he was. But this town would always hold a special place in his heart. It had shown him that justice wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about giving people the courage to stand up, to speak out, to reclaim their community. At the city limits, he pulled over to look back at the town silhouetted against the evening sky. Barrett had been wrong about one thing. This wasn't his town. It belonged to all its people, and now, finally, they all had a chance to be part of its story. The setting sun painted the clouds in shades of hope, reminding him that sometimes the most important victories aren't won with handcuffs and badges, but with patience, courage, and the unchangeable power of truth.